So you probably have heard the word tenure. You probably have not heard it connected to the word promotion, though you probably know what a promotion is. But I want to share with you a couple comics that I think give us an idea about how tenure is popularly viewed. Right here, this is from Pearls Before Swine by Stephen Pastis, an awesome cartoonist. Hi, officer. Thanks for coming. Listen, it looks like someone has broken into our house and smashed all our stuff with a sledgehammer or something. Any idea who? Who? I did it, officer. I confess. Who are you? I'm a professor. Were you under arrest? I have tenure. Nothing we can do, boys. Curse you, tenured professor guy. In your face. In your face. And I have to confess, I do this at least 2 or 3 times a month whenever I feel stressed. Or just because. This is from phdcomics.com, which is actually like it's done by science people, but it's, I think, so some of the stuff doesn't necessarily connect to history, but it's still, a lot of it is, I think, quite accurate. And I love this. How to tell the difference between a tenured and an untenured professor, and it has to do with walking speed, which is crazy until you get tenured, and then as you go further and further until you get to emeritus, it goes down, so you become slower. So you had the young assistant professor walking like crazy, and you had the tenured professor just taking his time. And this is very accurate. A lot of times when you're an assistant professor, like, you literally finish getting ready for a class right before the class starts. So, and then finally, I enjoy that. This is just the general kind of conversations that you have, and why it's difficult, by the way, when you're studying, working on a PhD and trying to become a professor. It's hard to get people to understand your situation. Mom, I'm trying to finish my PhD. Having kids is the last thing on my mind. Okay. What about after? Well, I might do a postdoc after this. You know what a postdoc is now. And after that, I don't know, another postdoc. Then tenure takes at least 6 years. Your thesis is the closest I'll get to a grandchild, isn't it? Yes, and you're interrupting labor. Right? It just, this is, by the way, also one reason why I tell people, do you really want to do this academic thing? Because you got to dedicate your whole life to it, basically. But you can see that, she wants to get the tenure job. That's the main idea. She's going to have to sacrifice a lot for it. And then you've got this idea that tenure really makes your life a lot easier. So now we need to talk a little bit about what tenure exactly is, and what promotion is, and how this is all connected to rank. So tenure is not what people think it is, right? Basically, the joke was this professor had tenure and he could do whatever he wanted to do. That's just not how it works. Your tenure can be revoked. There are lots of reasons why they can get rid of a tenured professor, but it's still a good thing. You still want it. Because it is hard to, unless you basically break the law or really make a terrible mistake, or do something really bad on purpose, you're not going to lose your job for the most part if you are tenured. When you're untenured, and that's typically the first 6 years of your career as an assistant professor, when you're untenured, you sign a contract for 1 year, and it's renewed every year typically. Some places it's 3 years, other places it's 1 year, but they can just say, well, we're not giving you a contract this year, and we don't have to give you a reason. So when you're untenured, basically, you could lose your job from year to year, right? And this is kind of a big deal because, you picked up and moved to get this job, right? So it's good to have tenure, because then they can't really get rid of you unless they have a really, really good reason. When you're untenured, you can just be let go for basically, they don't have to give you a reason. They just don't give you a contract, right? So you go through this. Usually what happens is when you're hired, you're what's called an assistant professor. And tenure and promotion are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Promotion has to do with rank. Tenure has to do, and your rank also determines your pay. Tenure, it determines whether or not it's easy to get rid of you. So when you're an assistant professor, you are doing your best to publish and to have good to do service and to have good teaching evaluations. You want students to, say good things about you in your evaluations. You maybe feel like teaching evaluations don't matter. Teaching evaluations matter a lot, right? We usually go over them when you have your annual review. Now, if you're an assistant professor, here's what happens. You're doing your best to do service. You're doing your best to teach. You're doing your best to do research. And every year, your colleagues, the other people in the department, have a meeting, which you don't attend, and they decide whether or not they want to recommend that you be, be rehired for the next year. You have to survive this for 6 years. You don't usually go up for tenure until your 6th year, and then they tell you in your 7th. So one thing I want to stress about the meeting too, you may say, well, that's okay. I just have to convince the majority. No. Everyone has to say yes. If only one person says no, that's considered kind of a crisis, and there'll be an even bigger meeting, which you might attend. This never happened to me, fortunately, to determine whether or not you should continue. So you have to make every other professor happy, and they all have to say, yes, we want to keep this person. In addition, and that happens every year. And then every year you would meet with either your chair or dean or both, and they will go over your teaching evaluations, that meeting, and just talk about how you're doing. And that happens every year. You're also compiling what's called a tenure binder. So all of your teaching evaluations, things you've written, thank you cards from students. Giving a thank you card to a professor is really awesome. Not only is it nice, but something you can throw in your tenure binder, and people can say, oh, this is a professor that the students like. And my first binder was this thick, full of documents. My second binder, which I didn't have to turn in, but it's called an ancillary binder. It's just extra stuff I think people should consider. The first binder is like what they require. The second is just extra stuff. It was about this thick. So I turned that in so that when I'm up for tenure in my 6th year, the tenure and promotion committee, made up of professors from all throughout the university, can look at it, and then they decide whether or not they recommend that I go forward for tenure. The provost, or VPAA, who I'll talk about later, decide whether or not to accept the committee's recommendations, and then the president of the university has to decide whether or not to accept all these recommendations. So if you want tenure for a period of 6 years, you have to make every professor in your department happy. You have to make your chair happy. You have to make your dean happy, and you have to convince a lot of and after 6 years, you have to convince a lot of professors from outside your department that you are competent, and you have to convince the provost and the president. Now, usually the president and the provost will accept recommendations, but they don't have to. They can decide to overturn other people's decisions. So I have been through that process. Successfully, fortunately, and I therefore was given tenure, meaning it's harder to get rid of me, basically. And then I became an associate professor. So that my rank went up. That's promotion. That meant I got a higher pay, and I received tenure. Now you may say, well, how are those things different? Well, like I said, tenure is just whether or not it's easy, how easy it is to get rid of you, basically. Promotion is your rank, and rank determines things like pay. Now, let's say that I were to go to another university. I don't plan on doing that. I love it here at Lander, but let's say I did. They may hire me, and they'll keep my rank associate professor, but they may not give me tenure, meaning they can just fire me after the contract if they want. That's why it's dangerous once you're associate professor, in a sense, to try and switch universities. As an associate professor, you still will, you don't have that meeting where everybody meets without you, but you still have a yearly evaluation. You still have to put together a binder. But if you're assistant professor and you don't get tenure, it basically means you're fired. If you're assistant professor and you don't get tenure, sometimes they'll give you an extra year so you can find another job, but they can also just say, goodbye. Now, if you're associate professor, you still go through this process, but it's not as strict. And it's basically to see whether or not, after 6 years, if you can be promoted to full professor. And if you get promoted, then you get a higher pay and so forth. When you retire, the university, if you've done your job well, can name you a professor emeritus. That's just basically an honorific way of saying retired professor. And usually you keep certain privileges. If you're at a university that has lots of office space, they sometimes will give you an office. If not, they'll still give you library privileges and things like that. Employee discounts at the cafeteria, things like that. But a professor emeritus is a professor who has basically retired from being a professor. I do want to talk about a couple other terms that you may hear. One is adjunct. You may have heard of someone who's a adjunct professor. An adjunct is someone who teaches for a class by class basis. So they're paid to teach by class. They do not have to do any research. They do not have to do any service. However, they are only paid to teach a class and they don't get any benefits. And usually there's kind of two reasons you hire adjuncts. One is that there's just a lot of classes you need to teach. Like there's a lot of 100 level classes and we just don't have enough professors to teach all those. So you hire someone who has the requisite degree and they just teach one class or two classes. And a lot of times those are graduate students who are still working on their dissertation and they need the experience. And so they'll come in and do it. Other times it's someone who, so a lot of times that's what it is. Other times it's someone in the community who has specialized knowledge. So for example, there may be a lawyer who's an expert in patent law, and that lawyer might be hired to teach a class on patent law, right? That gives us the ability, we maybe wouldn't be able to have a professor who teaches patent law every year, but we could certainly hire this lawyer every couple of years to teach the class. And then he or she could share their knowledge with the wider community, with the students in that way. But an adjunct is someone who teaches on a per class basis, right? It's not tenure track. And a lot of people are either, they have another job, they just want to teach, like the lawyer example I gave, or they're people looking for experience. An instructor is oftentimes someone who does not have a PhD, but may have a master's degree. And sometimes they're called a lecturer as well. And they are a complex kind of position. But like I said, sometimes it's just it's not tenure track, but they can still get tenure. Like they can get it's very complex. But you'll also see someone that'll say like instructor. Usually instructors are more focused on teaching. They oftentimes don't have to do any research, for example, and they may or may not be tenured. And a lot of times this is someone who just isn't interested in doing research and they need someone to teach a whole bunch of classes. So they hire that person to do that. One thing I should point out, whatever these people are, whatever their rank is, it's always polite to address them as professor. Now, you wouldn't call someone who has a master's degree a doctor because they aren't a doctor. They only have a master's degree. But a person who holds a master's degree, perfectly appropriate and polite to call them professor. So if you're not sure what someone's rank is, just call them professor. All right, instructor, adjunct, professor emeritus, full professor, you just call them professor. And by the way, that's a professor who's inspired me, Ludwig von Drake. So as a way of kind of ending this, I do feel like I should explain some other terminology. This is maybe getting a little bit boring, so I thought I'd include a couple comics I think are funny. My body cannot endure formal education. Is this deception? This is not deception. I'll measure your mouth hotness to verify your claim. Your malfunction is legitimate. You may occupy the life center. The cost is correct. I cannot learn today. I hope you're still learning. This doesn't really have that much to do with being a professor, but if you look at Professor's Doors, you'll see comics like this, and this is Strange Planet, which is a webtoon, which is hilarious. This is XKCD by Randall Munroe, and I like this. This is an interdisciplinary program in which physics students try to hit psychology students with pendulums. Promising. My professor has had an ongoing competition to get the weirdest thing taken seriously under the label interdisciplinary program. Okay. Now that you've been suitably entertained, I need to explain a little bit about college organization. I think this will make it so that some of the things we ask you to do will make more sense. So each university is broken up into different administrative units. Kind of the basic unit on the academic side is a department. So at Lander University, we have a Department of History and Philosophy. At the time of this recording, we have 5 historians and 1 philosopher. And among us, one of us is appointed chair. And the chair is basically the head of the department. So if there's a certain policy that should be taken care of, if there's certain information that needs to be collected, the university might send an email, or it's more likely the dean, who I'll talk about momentarily, will send an email to the chairs and say, chairs, I need you to gather this information from your professors. So the chair is the head of the department, right? So if you need something that has the chair's signature, the chair is the head of the department. Now, there's also something called a college, and different universities use different names, but a college is made up of multiple departments, right? So you have a college that's made up of multiple departments. So the history and philosophy department. There's also the psychology department. There's, I believe was it the GSIS department as well. So we have multiple departments. I think that's like political science and government and so forth. Political science is also its own department. So you have multiple departments all under one dean. And then Lander has multiple colleges, each headed by a dean. So you'd have I think it's physical and mathematical sciences, arts and humanities, I believe the College of Business. Each one of these has a dean that's the head, right? And usually the dean is the one who will tell chairs, I need certain information. And a lot of times the dean is also going to be meeting with other deans to set certain policies. And you can kind of see how this works, right? The deans get together and talk about an issue facing students. So we may want to add a certain course to Gen Ed or something like that. And Gen Ed is something that's considered owned, in a sense, not by a particular college or department, but by the whole university. So the deans would get together and discuss that, and then give instructions to the departments based on their discussions. And you may have had to send in like a petition or like a course substitution request or something like that, and you would have your advisor and the chair and the dean sign it. So the reason they all have to sign that is because later the dean has to explain to the other deans why your petition should or should not be granted. Right? So a lot of times, you have these very powerful people. I mean, deans are very powerful. By the way, when I get NU evaluated, both these people, evaluate me, my chair and my dean. So like I said, they're very powerful people. And they get together to decide, how your petition is going to be treated. So you've got the deans. Above the deans is what's called, and it depends on the university, and sometimes you have both these titles, the vice president of academic affairs or the provost. So that's kind of the person who is above the deans and who coordinates the deans and chairs and acts as a kind of intermediary between the administration, like the president of the university, and the academic part. So it's like the highest academic officer. And a lot of times what will happen is the deans, if there's if we want to make a new program, to help our students, that we identified a need. Like there's maybe there's a new nursing degree that should be developed to help us train nurses better, or to fill a niche that's needed. The deans and the vice president of academic affairs would meet together to decide, can we do this? Do we have the faculty to do this, or do we need to hire someone? If we need to hire someone, would this program bring in enough students to make that hire worthwhile? So this is kind of how the university works. And I wanted to go through this just so you can get a better idea of how this works, but also so you can get a sense, okay, this is what it means, what a department chair is, this is what a dean is. And if you do interview for an academic job, you have to talk to these people. And I want to point out, you may have to talk to them yourself. Please note, these are very, very busy people. All people deserve respect, but these people in particular, they have a lot of power and authority. And I think is a good Confucian that, you therefore give them even a little extra politeness, a little bit extra respect, and do understand they're very busy because of all their administrative jobs. So try and be patient with them. And also this is why it's a big deal if the dean asks you, gives you an award, or you get dean's list or something like that. That's why it's a big deal. But hopefully that's given you some sense of what the academic world is like, and will hopefully help you navigate as an undergraduate and graduate school should you decide to go there.